of all, I just want to explain the title of this talk because it's called The Rise and Fall of the IWW. And I want to make sure that there's no misunderstanding because, of course, the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, is still around, as we well know. It never went away. And generation after generation of committed activists have kept the IWW alive and its principles alive. And really, more than a few of today's young radicals are being schooled in the politics of class struggle by their involvement in the IWW. So just to be clear, just like everybody else who has a class conscience in this country, we also love union baristas. And it will be a great day indeed when every Starbucks across the US and the world has the IWW Union Shop logo emblazed on its walls. Now that we've cleared up that little issue, I want to explain that this talk is going to be focused primarily on what we would call like the heyday of the industrial workers of the world, also known as the Wobblies. There's no clear explanation how the name Wobbly came about, but it certainly is as applicable as the IWW. And the heyday really was between the IWW's founding of the IWW in 1905 and the next 15, 20 odd years. And, unfortunately, what I also need to explore is why the IWW is all but decimated by the mid-1920s. So I want to pretty much, that's why I called it the rise and fall. In 1905, the IWW was, of course, way ahead of its time. It advanced the cause of industrial unionism decades before industrial unionism was actually achieved in the 1930s during the great strikes of the Great Depression, and the CIO finally succeeded in organizing skilled and unskilled workers side by side into the same unions. It's no exaggeration to say that to this day, the IWW stands out as the very best of the US working class tradition, committed single-mindedly to the self-emancipation of the working class, committed to waging class war against its capitalist enemies. Now, the capitalists, just for their part, in case there was any confusion, they were even more hostile to the Wobblies. They caricatured the Wobblies as an organization of degenerate hobos who just wanted to go around dynamiting private property for the heck of it, in between when they were in barroom brawls or whatever else they did, and calling the IWW the union of, I want whiskey and I won't work. So they caricatured, and this was in newspapers all over the country, they caricatured the Wobblies really actually as people of violence or workers intent on violence in order to justify their own violence against the IWW members, much as the label of terrorist today is used to persecute and prosecute innocent people today. Very similar tradition of the US ruling class. Now, Big Bill Haywood is probably the single most famous leader of the IWW, and in many ways he was an archetype of the IWW kind of core cadre. He was a very burly, self-educated worker. He had started working in the mines at the age of 9. He lost one eye and never bothered to get a glass eye to replace it. Supposedly he turned whenever his photo was being taken, he would turn his good eye towards the camera. He had already, by the time of the founding of the IWW, he had already put in many years himself personally in the class war and was already very well known around the country as a leader in the Western Federation of Miners. And he was actually the person who called the first IWW convention to order in 1905. And he put forward the following words, which I think really embody the organization. He said, the aims and objects of this organization should be to put the working class in possession of the economic power, the means of life, in control of production and distribution without regard to capitalist masters. And they never, you have to say, they never wavered from these principles. And it's also worth really pointing out that the unionists that were in attendance at the IWW's historic convention really represented some of the most important and principled labor leaders of the time. It included Eugene Debs, veteran leader of the 1894 Pullman strike, and really the most famous Socialist Party agitator of his time, or probably ever, mining organizer Mother Jones, who coined the phrase, mourn the dead but fight like hell for the living. Lucy Parsons, who was the widow of Albert Parsons, who was one of the Haymarket martyrs, and she was also a radical leader in her own right. The African-American socialist Hubert Henry Harrison was also at the founding convention and a part of the IWW as well as the Socialist Party. And besides Big Bill Haywood, there were also a whole bunch of leaders from the Western Federation of Miners at that conference who formed who really forged the organization at its beginning. And these were the class fighters who really put forward and dedicated themselves to building a new kind of unionism that would unite the entire working class. Now, Haywood's own experience at the Western Federation of Miners had taught him that craft unionism, which was the dominant unionism at the time, in which it not only excluded the unskilled, but also separated skilled workers by craft. So your contract might be up in April, you settle, yours is up in May, and it really prevents the working class from coming together at the same time in a common struggle. And he rightly attributed the Western Federation's defeat in a 3-year-long strike between 1903 and 1905. It was called the Cripple Creek Strike, and he rightly understood that the railroad unions, which were organized by craft, continued to haul the ore from the striking mines, or run by strikebreakers, to the mills that were also run by strikebreakers. So basically, the way he put it, he said, the railroaders, who were union, formed the connecting link in the proposition that is scabby at both ends. This fight, he said, which is entering its 3rd year, could have been won in 3 weeks if it were not for the fact that the trade unions are lending assistance to the mine operators. And from the time of the IWW's founding, Wobblies referred to the American Federation of Labor as the American Separation of Labor, and they referred to the AFL leaders as labor fakers. I don't think they ever used a respectful term for them. The IWW never lost focus on its aim to build on the basis of class struggle and maybe most importantly, welcoming all members of the working class into its union. At the founding convention, Big Bill Haywood, he angrily denounced the AFL unions, in his words, that prohibit the initiation of a colored man. And then he went on to say and declared that the IWW recognizes neither race, creed, color, sex, or previous condition of servitude. Now, to fully appreciate how revolutionary just those words, which now seem so common to us, how revolutionary they were at that time, you have to appreciate how reactionary and how unspeakably racist U.S. society was at that time. We're talking about the first couple of decades of the 20th century. Racism in particular was the bedrock of U.S. society at every level. Everything flowed from the racist, white supremacist order. And yet the IWW was an organization that was willing to organize the unskilled when virtually no other union would, that not only welcomed African Americans, but actively fought racial segregation at a time when the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, actively promoted racial segregation. They not only organized women workers at a time when the AFL refused to organize women workers, but they also promoted women's rights from birth control to the right to vote, which again were revolutionary at the time. The Wobblies not only actively helped to organize immigrant workers, but stood shoulder to shoulder with all immigrants who then faced tremendous racial discrimination. We don't hear about it much today, but the theory of eugenics was the dominant institution of thought and quote unquote science at the time. And it was truly invented by the US ruling class, embracing as scientific this theory based on, by the way, research that was funded by ruling class families like the Rockefellers, the Kellogg cereal family, And eugenics is basically a theory that's based on a really bizarre twist of Darwin's theory of evolution, basically taking Darwin's idea of survival of the fittest and applying it to class society. The white wealthy elite reached the self-serving conclusion that they had reached such ridiculous levels of wealth, not by robbing the working class, no. They were wealthy because they were genetically superior to all other races. And there were many races that they felt superior to at the time. Now, the eugenics movement, you have to keep in mind, came to prominence at the beginning of the 20th century, just as Jim Crow segregation laws were being escalated throughout the Deep South. They were really two sides of the same coin. The main target of the eugenics movement always was African Americans. Let there be no doubt about that. But it also targeted all sorts of other immigrant groups, like Mexicans and Latin Americans, which of course continues to this day. But at the time, it was immigrants from Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, as quote unquote racially inferior. Now, this no doubt helped employers sleep even better at night while feeding their immigrant workers starvation wages while they were working entire families, including children, to the bone. I just want to give you one small example of the attitude. During the 1902 coal strike, Reading Railroad President George Berger, he infamously responded to reports that 145,000 strikers and their families were starving by saying, quote, "They don't suffer. Why, they can't even speak English," end quote. Now, just one example of how starvation wages affected workers' lives and health at the time. A study of the workforce in the textile mill town of Lawrence, Massachusetts in 1912 found that the workers, half the workforce was women and children, found that the workers were literally starving to death. The average spinner in that Lawrence mill died at the age of 36, about 30 years younger than the average lawyer or clergyman at the time. So to fully appreciate the heroism of the IWW leaders and the challenges that they faced, it's necessary in particular to focus on this colossal degree of racism, specifically against African Americans, and that's north and south of the Mason-Dixon line, because Jim Crow segregation laws, lynching, that's usually what gets focused on, if, on the rare occasion that it does. But the many forms of violence against Black people were not limited to the Deep South, but actually permeated the entirety of U.S. society. Many restaurants, as far north as Boston, and probably even further north, I'm mentioning Boston, no offense to any Bostonians here, although I grew up in a very racist city right by Boston called Providence, Rhode Island. The violence and deep racism extended throughout society. So many restaurants, many stores refused to cater to Black customers. And if Black workers and sharecroppers were super exploited in the South, the truth is that just about no northern employer would hire a Black person except as anything but a strikebreaker, consciously stoking racism to keep Black and white workers divided. And in 1908, right here in Illinois, in Springfield, the birthplace of Abraham Lincoln, you can see how the dynamic played out, because after there had been numerous strikes, had been a strike wave, and the companies had broken most of these strikes using Black strikebreakers. Well, guess what happened soon thereafter? A mob of thousands of whites went on the rampage throughout. They basically rushed over to African American neighborhoods. They burnt down Black businesses, Black homes, set them on fire, and lynched a bunch of Black men. Now, they were charged. Oh, let's be clear. They were charged with a crime, but guess what? Not a single rioter was ever convicted of any of the crimes. In 1903, the Encyclopedia Britannica defined the word Negro as follows, quote, Weight of brain as indicating cranial capacity, 35 ounces. Height gorilla, 20. Average European, 45. The inherent mental inferiority of the blacks, an inferiority which is even more marked than their physical differences. No full-blooded Negro has ever been distinguished as a man of science, a poet, or an artist, end quote. Okay? This is at the same time that the IWW was being formed. I hope I'm not going on too much. I'm so angry. I have to. I'm sorry. I'm compelled to continue. I'm almost done. I know I'm boring you terribly with this. Yeah. Likewise, the President of the United States, William Taft, in 1908, remarked that African Americans, quote, were political children not having the mental status of manhood, end quote. In 1911, not all that far from here in Livermore, Kentucky, a theater sold tickets for the lynching of an African American. The people in the orchestra seats paid top dollar to fire as many shots as they wanted to. Those in the cheaper seats were only allowed one shot. So, just absorb that for a moment and think about what the IWW really stood for in this kind of lynch mob atmosphere. It's also important to emphasize that racism was embraced not only by the American Federation of Labor, and I could go on and on about the president, Sam Gompers, who regularly, but I won't, he regularly referred to African Americans as, quote, darkies, and referred to, was so anti-immigrant, it's unspeakable. But, and really sought, he embraced the eugenics movement and sought the purity of the white race. But racism was also embraced by a substantial portion of the Socialist Party at the time. And I don't have time to go into a whole lot of detail, but I want to just give you a couple of examples here. One of the main leaders of the Socialist Party, Victor Berger, was an open segregationist. He declared at one point, and this is a quote from him, "There can be no doubt that the Negroes and mulattoes constitute a lower race, that the Caucasian and Mongolian have the start of them in civilization by many thousand years," as he motivated his reason for wanting segregation. Socialist Party agitator Kate Richards O'Hare, who actually, if you Google her, most of what comes up about her is how committed she was to women's rights and how she went to prison for being against the First World War. Well, what you find if you dig a little deeper is that Kate Richards O'Hare actually wrote a pamphlet that has the N-word in its title, Blank Equality. She uses the N-word dozens of times in a pamphlet that was only 3 pages long. She appeals to Southern racists, assuring them that the future socialist society will be thoroughly segregated. This is how she put it. Socialists want to put the Negro where he can't compete with the white man. Most Southern branches in the Socialist Party refuse to allow African Americans to join. So that's the worst element. And just for the record, the Socialist Party always voted down objections to laws against immigration and so on and so forth. And Victor Berger was also against giving the vote to women. I mean, again, there's a whole story to be told there, but I just want to give you kind of the most key elements. Now, even Eugene Debs, who represents the best of the socialist tradition in the United States, and himself was a revolutionary socialist. However, his opposition to racism was completely inadequate given the scale of racism that existed. Yes, he refused to speak in front of segregated audiences. I mean, he was clear that he was against racism, but he also refused to incorporate the fight against racism into the fight for unions. And this is what he said: "We have nothing special to offer the Negro, and we cannot make separate appeals to all races." End quote. Now, I'm laying this all out in such detail so you can fully appreciate how extraordinary the IWW's principles were in its heyday. The IWW faced hostility from pretty much all corners of society, from the American Federation of Labor. You're arrested for being in the IWW. Bingo, you're arrested for being an immigrant. or they pass laws making it illegal to go on strike, whatever it is, you know. Other IWW leaders found themselves imprisoned or put to death on trumped-up murder charges. Big Bill Haywood himself was put in prison on a trumped-up murder charge, coincidentally, just a few months after the founding of the IWW, and he spent the next year and a half fighting for his life on this trumped-up charge, which he was finally acquitted for. Not everyone was so lucky. Now, what's so amazing is how the Wobblies never lost. They always had this fighting spirit, even in the face of trial and imprisonment. They were known, for example, if a bunch of them were in a jail together, for singing songs from the Little Red Songbook, the IWW songbook, from their prison cells all night long, to the great annoyance of the prison guards. You can't help but feel that there was an extra motivation there. One Wobbly, John Dornan, he gave a 5-hour speech to the jury during his own trial, and he ended by saying, quote, "It is customary with IWW speakers to take up a collection, but under these circumstances, I think we will dispense with it." They just, it's amazing. And of course, the IWW's most famous songwriter, Joe Hill, as we know, was executed by a firing squad on a trumped-up murder charge in Utah. His final words were written in a letter to Big Bill Haywood, which famously said, "Don't mourn, organize." That's what it's known for. Lesser well known is he went on to say, he asked Big Bill Haywood to bring his body, his dead body, to the state line because he said, quote, "I don't want to be caught dead in Utah." Bill carried out his wishes. Government repression, during World War I, government repression got worse. What I've described as pre-war, okay? Yeah. During the war and then into the 1920s, the war was extremely unpopular. So of course the government had to make it illegal, a crime, to speak out against the war. So even uttering a statement against the war would land you in prison. And many socialists and IWW members ended up in prison for that. After the war ended, there was a very sharp uprising in class struggle. And so what many states decided to do is keep the laws on the books that had been in during the war. Like, for example, making it a crime to have a group assemble anywhere in public. So they would just round people up and throw them in jail. They also, with a wink and a nod, there were mobs of vigilantes that were whipped up into an anti-IWW frenzy that, coincidentally seemed to arrive right at the spot, same time as the cops did, to crack down on IWW members all around the country, sometimes tarring and feathering them, or as in the case of Frank Little, hanging him from a tree. The IWW's guiding principle was, of course, an injury to one is an injury to all, and this has been the bedrock of the labor movement, the best of the labor movement since capitalism came into being, and continues to guide us to this very day. Now, you got to know that it's true, the Wobblies lost almost every strike that they got involved in, the vast majority, mainly due to government repression. But its one shining victory was the 1912 textile workers strike in Lawrence, Massachusetts, when not only did roughly 20,000 textile workers win their strike in a 2-month-long bitter, bitter battle, but the strike was led mainly by immigrant women workers who used tactics that have since become staples in the labor movement. For example, the local government decided to make it illegal for workers to assemble outside the factory building that they were striking. So they formed a moving picket line of thousands of workers surrounding the factory and stated they had all just decided to go for a walk. That has been a staple of our movement ever since. The police arrested a few men at the time, thinking that let's get the leaders of the strike. They must be men, of course. So they arrested them on a trumped-up murder charge. Just got to go on record that that's pretty much the standard, yeah. But then the police were shocked when this did not slow down the strikers. One police captain told a newspaper, "I tell you, there were no leaders in the streets. The crowds on the street were usually led by women and children." But actually, the IWW made a special effort always to encourage women to be leaders. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, one of the most amazing IWW leaders, herself, like barely 20, she said, the IWW has been accused of putting women in the front. The truth is the IWW does not keep them in back and they go to the front, end quote. And those who think workers are too divided by ethnicity and cultural differences to ever unite and fight in a common struggle should be aware that the Lawrence Victory Party, after the strike, the workers sang the Internationale in over a dozen different languages. The Wobblies, of course, advocated direct action, most importantly strike action, with the aim of forming one big union that could carry out one big general strike to bring down capitalism. And the IWW described this strategy as revolutionary unionism. But this meant different things to different people. Eventually, it's true, the IWW evolved into a more consciously anarcho-syndicalist organization, which really means, broadly speaking, a strategy to overthrow the capitalist system by means of the class struggle, say with a one big general strike, and to replace capitalism with a democratically self-managed cooperative of workers. Now, there's many different variations of that, but I'm just trying to describe it in sweeping terms. It's also important to recognize that the lines at that time between socialism and anarchism were not all that distinct in the Wobblies' early years, and it was possible to bring together all kinds of radicals, from members of the Socialist Party, members of the Socialist Labor Party, and alongside anarchos, syndicalists, and other forms of anarchism. And all these forces did attend the founding convention. And Marxism, was a big part of it. Most IWW members adhere to the whole notion of historical materialism, Marx's notion that the history of all hitherto existing societies was the history of class struggle. So this was, in common agreement. However, for those on the left who ask today, why can't the left just all get along? I think the IWW's experience showed that however hard they tried, that wasn't all that easy, not because the issues were trivial, but because there were urgent strategy questions at stake. And over its first 3 years, to be honest, the IWW lost many of its key socialists, including Eugene Debs of the Socialist Party, Daniel De Leon of the Socialist Labor Party, although I hear it wasn't such a big loss to lose him, and the entire Western Federation of Miners. These were not, again, trivial differences, but most often were about what role politics was going to play in revolutionary struggle. And they're crucial. That's a crucial issue. You have to keep in mind that the early years of the 20th century, the Bolsheviks were still, they were still in their infancy. And, the IWW was founded in 1905 and expressed solidarity with the 1905 Russian Revolution. But for most people, and including for people in the IWW, politics equal voting. Voting either for one of the two capitalist parties, Democrats or Republicans, or maybe for the Socialist Party. And the way Sidney Lenz described the dispute, historian Sidney Lenz, of the dispute at the 1908 convention, he said, the Western migratory workers who poured into Chicago in blue denim overalls singing Hallelujah, I'm a Bum, were not particularly enamored of the ballot box. And I think that kind of sums up the way a lot of IWW members looked at it. And, the truth is that even though Eugene Debs won 6% of the vote or close to it when he ran for president in 1912, the Socialist Party itself was mainly an electoral machine. And true enough, many IWW members had dual membership in the Socialist Party and the IWW. This included Big Bill Haywood. They did not regard politics as important to the IWW. So sort of like, this is my political act and this is my revolutionary act or my economic act. And so they didn't, coordinate or integrate the two goals. And so unfortunately, this led the IWW to pretty much ignore the other aspect of politics, the state, including the federal government, which, as we know, is a tool for enforcing corporate rule. The idea that revolution could be accomplished by one big strike really failed to take into account the inevitable violence of the state. And that's, this is even though IWW members were regularly rounded up and thrown in jail by the police, regularly unjustly imprisoned by the courts, troops were regularly called in to crush strikes and shoot at peaceful, unarmed strikers. So their own experience should have spoken against this idea. And actually, a former IWW member, William Z. Foster, who left the IWW to go organize inside the AFL, this is how he described the problem, really, of anarcho-syndicalism. He said, the tendency of the labor movement to confine the revolutionary class struggle of the workers in the economic field and to practically ignore the state. Its fighting organization is the trade union. Its basic method of class warfare is the strike, with the general strike as the revolutionary weapon, and its revolutionary goal is setting up a trade union, he puts in quotes, state, to conduct industry and all other social activities. But ignoring the state for the IWW proved to be absolutely a catastrophic decision for them. And they paid an enormous price for the repression directed against them by the US government. James P. Cannon, who ended up being a founder of and leader of the US Trotskyist movement, he started out in the IWW. And the way he put it, this is how he summed it up. He said, the, quote, political action of the capitalist state broke the back of the IWW as a union. And just like maybe to just take one step back and just examine even the notion of revolutionary unionism, because it's really a contradiction in terms. A union, by definition, has to be a reform organization. It's a contract between workers and the capitalists that employ them. That is, the workers and their exploiters. So it assumes that there's a system of exploitation in place. A revolutionary organization is dedicated to getting rid of the capitalist system. And the IWW wasn't able to accomplish either of its purposes effectively because it was trying to combine them into one organization. Unions require contracts. And actually, the IWW was loath to sign a contract with the employers. So the IWW's one big victorious strike, the Lawrence Strike of 1912, it brought 14,000 new members into the IWW, and a year later, there were only a few hundred workers left in the IWW in Lawrence, Massachusetts. Estimates are that about 1 million workers passed through the IWW in its early years, but most of them didn't stay long. So it never really achieved the kind of massive size that it could have. And finally, really, revolutionary organizations require politics way beyond the ballot box. The Russian Revolution of 1917 brought this issue to a head really the world over, and everybody was kind of forced to take a stand. Were you for the revolution or were you against it? And actually, the Socialist Party leadership opposed the Russian Revolution simply because it was a revolution and not an electoral victory. And at that point, there was a big fight in the party, and they expelled about 2/3 of their members who were for the Russian Revolution as a means of winning the argument, winning a majority. Yeah. And many of those expelled went on to form the Communist Party in 1920 as really a step forward in our understanding of what a revolutionary party should be. The IWW also split over the Russian Revolution because of the role the party played in the revolution, and because it maintained a state, even if it was a worker state, after the revolution was victorious. As Cannon put it, and actually those who, in the IWW, who supported the Russian Revolution ended up leaving the IWW and going over and joining the new Communist Party that was forming. So, that's really in a sense, it was the lessons that were learned of that period and how the organizational outcome of those lessons. Now, just to conclude, I've presented this history and have emphasized the weaknesses as well as the strengths of the IWW, because although the times have changed in many ways since then, we face the same strategic questions that the working class movement and the revolutionary movement faced at that time. And I just want to be absolutely clear that even though the IWW's anti-political, anti-party, anti-political approach certainly played a role in its undoing, we can never forget that it was the barbaric repression by the US government that physically destroyed the Wobblies in this country. And we certainly should never forget that just as that Little Red Songbook to this day is really one of the most inspiring pieces of working class culture in existence that's influenced generation after generation, so too has the IWW's revolutionary legacy, and we can fully expect that it's going to continue to inspire the next generations for the foreseeable future. Thank you. There's a whole bunch of stuff that's come up here. I want to restrict my comments to a few themes that I'm going to talk about here. What Leighton I think Leighton and Alex are making two slightly different points. One is, and I couldn't agree more with Leighton, that obviously we welcome anybody who wants to be part of the labor movement. We think that the IWW has brought back some fighting spirit into the labor movement, and there's no question about that. I think Alex is making a slightly different point, which is that the kind of contradictions of the past are less so. That is the contradiction between, there's less of a separation between the economic and the political. I guess I would disagree with that and I think that's why some of the same strategic issues still confront us, because I think it was Nancy that was saying, the IWW, you could go out and Joe was saying, there was no official policy at that time against, say the war in the Philippines, which came up, or the war on the Philippines, I should say, or any of that stuff. But individual members, would be the same kind of thing. You're having a rally, somebody can get up and speak against a death penalty or they conducted political campaigns in defense of their members that were put in prison. Women, members of the IWW, went and organized for the right to vote, organized all kinds of stuff around women's rights like birth control. But the IWW itself did not take a stand on these issues. And, so I just feel like those, in a way, you can't say, well, be in the IWW and be a revolutionary socialist if there's a contradiction there politically. And so, I think there are some arguments that we have to have about the state and about politics. And that's really what I want to speak to, spend just about the rest of my time speaking to. Because, Daniel DeLeon, Adam really spoke to, he was an incorrigible sectarian, and he did turn a lot of the IWW members off of politics, even though he was more radical than the Socialist Party. He didn't know how to get along with people. So they would have these knockdown, drag-out fights. He would call the Western Federation of Miners a bunch of bums, and that's a quote, "you're bums," and imply that they were not intelligent. And then that just fed the Western Federation of Miners idea that, oh, you're just a bunch of They even said at one point, what are you going to do, throw your books at, the troops that are coming on you? No, it was that kind of animosity. So, again, he did no service to the notion of politics, besides the fact that he was very brittle about and legalistic about his approach to politics. Now, I want to also say the role of the Democrats. See, it's not simple one way or the other. Yes, they did in the 1930s steal much of the kind of rhetoric of at least some of the socialist movement, and certainly the Socialist Party. But that, yes, it probably played a role in terms of the electoral defeats of the Socialist Party. But at the same time, it fed the confidence of the U.S. working class to struggle further and to aim their expectations higher. And that's why during that same period, between 1932 and 1936, you saw the biggest upsurge in class struggle in the United States that we've ever had. And by the end of 1936, with the occupation, the sit-down strike in Flint that actually brought down General Motors in early 1937, you actually saw the working class for a brief time go on the offensive. And Roosevelt because he granted reforms, he said, if the corporate class hates me, I welcome their hatred, all this kind of stuff, actually emboldened workers to go beyond the ballot box and so on. And that kind of leads me to talk about what is politics beyond the ballot box, because, let's put it this way. this is especially relevant in the United States, where this is one of the most repressive societies ideologically, politically, and in terms of state repression historically. And someone who said, oh, they probably wouldn't be as bad today, don't even think about it. Because just remember in 1992, when the Los Angeles Rebellion took place, they sent federal troops in to occupy Los Angeles for 4 days. They crushed that rebellion with troops. And so the issue of repression, by repression I mean the laws that get passed suddenly to make it illegal to have an ethnic studies program, for example, and just speaking hypothetically in Arizona, they can make anything illegal they want. That's what the court injunction is all about. And then suddenly you're on the wrong side of the law. That gives them the excuse to arrest you. And this is historically how they operate. So you can't just say, let's say, either you could say we elected a socialist president, okay? Let's say, I don't think anybody is really all that excited about it. I think it would be a good thing. But that wouldn't be the end of the issue and even if you had a general strike, which applies directly to the IWW, we have a general strike, we bring down the capitalist system. What happens the next day? We didn't really bring down the capitalist system. You think the corporate interests are going to just say, all right, we'll be socialists now. Take the money and run, guys. We've been exploiting you all these years. It doesn't work that way. And the military is answerable to the corporations through the vehicle of the state. And so we elect we have a huge Department of Defense. We have more military spending than all of our quote-unquote enemies combined. And so it's a really huge issue for us here. And so that's probably the most key element of politics, is preparing for that. And also how you're going to go about, we want a revolution, how are we going to go about doing that? And I'm going to conclude with that, because I think you have to always be very concrete about what the next steps are. And for us to say one big union and a general strike, maybe in Greece, Comrade Antonis can speak to that, but not here today, no. And you have to be very concrete about what the next steps are. And who were the vigilante mobs? They were all white. Just want to make sure everybody knows that. They were racist. And in Springfield, they were white workers who resented the fact that the capitalists were successful at divide and conquer. They brought in black strike breakers. The whites afterwards, suffering economically themselves, went after black homes and black neighborhoods. But it's also important to recognize that in Lawrence, Massachusetts, some of these vigilante mobs were, I think somebody mentioned it, run by leading citizens of, for example, Lawrence, Massachusetts. They were actually arrested, probably never convicted, but arrested for planting 3 bombs in Lawrence during the Lawrence strike in 1912, and then trying to blame it on the IWW. Well, unfortunately, they got caught. They were so incompetent. They were businessmen. In the Wild West, leading businessmen, of the town, upstanding citizens. And a lot of it, though, you have to understand, there was still a Wild West out there. And a lot of these vigilante mobs, especially out west, there was a degree of lawlessness at that, in the early 20th century that still existed out in the West. And that's, things were settled, let's say, not necessarily in the most, nonviolent manner. Okay. Finally, before I get to my very final point, I just want to say the issue that you brought up back there about permanent war and about how there were all these socialists and then the capitalist class introduced essentially permanent war. Well, number one, they introduced it a little bit earlier. Imperialist war, the war in the Philippines was the first imperialist war conducted by the U.S., and it certainly lasted for a long time and cost, I think, like 1 million lives of Filipinos because they had audacity to resist the occupation. But also, even if you were to accept that, it wouldn't explain why there was a huge radicalization in the 1930s and there was a huge radicalization in the 1960s. It's not simply, if anything, war can sometimes intensify, I think, for some people today. being at constant war has intensified the radicalization of lots of young people today who are like, there's been war ever since I can remember, since 2001. That's a long time if you're 18, So I think it's maybe just a more complex reason for that. Now, I just want to end by saying that today, in some ways, I want to say what the similarities are, is that today we are facing a labor movement that is so decayed. And there are some signs of life at labor notes. I think it's very exciting. I think young people are getting involved in the labor movement in a way that hasn't been the case for the last 35 years or so. We have a tremendously repressive state, and as I mentioned, just wait until you have a real, the Republic's windows and doors, they were taken by surprise. The candidate had to come out and say, oh yes, I sympathize with those workers. Try to see if there's a major strike that goes on for more than a couple hours. Then you will see the court injunctions start coming. You'll see the police start moving in. You'll see all kinds of repressive mechanisms coming from above. We also continue to face a horrific level of racism in this country. Arizona has finally drawn some attention, but let's face it, this country is polarized around immigration, polarized. And also, it's important to understand that the legacy of white supremacy lives on. And it is a noose around the U.S. labor movement, because the non-union South has everything to do with the fact that white supremacy has ruled the day and continues in, many ways to continue to rule the day in big parts of the South. Let's talk about Louisiana, Alabama. Let's go. Should I go on? Should I continue? Anyway, Mississippi, Delta. Yeah, okay. And so, these are the kinds of issues. Like, for example, today we have to say, how are we going to unionize not just the global South, the South half of the United States, so that we're not in constant competition with Southern workers who are non-union. That means we have to unionize the South. That's an immediate concern for us. We can only unionize the South if we fight racism. And I think that the demands are on now, and I think the timing is right for a new kind of dimension to unionism, which is that the fight against racism has to be part and parcel of that. The fight for immigrants' rights has to be part and parcel of that if we're going to succeed. I think the 1960s, I think it's really important to remember, that was not primarily a working class movement, but those struggles for women's rights, for lesbian and gay liberation, that is now LGBTQI liberation, those were not fought in vain. The struggles against racism of the 1960s, of the civil rights movement, people who died for that, to fight white supremacy, those have not been fought in vain. And now the immediate future for us is combining the struggle for civil rights with the struggle for workers' rights and ultimately revolution.